The reason that this is so important to me as a topic is because the hard work is learning all of the content, right? That's what you're spending your 4 years in medical school is. That's what you're doing for your internship here. You're learning the content, and then you've seen so many people. I'm sure you've seen them who know their content down cold, but sort of just miss easy opportunities to communicate their message better. And at the end of the day, people don't have the notion in their head that that's the reason that you were there and the reason you were talking to them. So, like an example of that from my first year in medical school, this is not actually a photo of them, but my first year in medical school, um, there's me, sitting over there, bored as can be, and the neuroanatomy instructor says, "You over there." It's not actually me; it was a friend of mine. Says, "You over there. Um, the person next to you is sleeping. Wake them up." And my classmate was clever enough to say, "Oh, no, no, it's your job to keep us awake. That's not my job." And I think he was true. So there's a lot to think about how you can speak, but it starts really with first impressions. And here's some examples of what not to say. And I'm not making these up. These are things people often say. They often start their first words, "I'm sorry, but," or this is one of my favorites. There's just too much material. So I'm going to talk really, really quickly now. No, you're here for an assignment. If there's too much material, edit out a chapter. You get to decide what material you're going to speak to. I actually had somebody say this, "I've been asked to talk about such and such. I'd rather be talking to you about this other thing, but I can't. They won't let me. So I'm going to talk to you about this." No, you're here to talk about this. Talk about it. These aren't my slides. I don't know this material. Dr. X asked me to talk about this. So, we bear with me. We'll get through this together. Again, I came to hear you. I don't want to hear an apology. Um, I know you can't see this. Well, then don't put it on the slide. The slide is a visual aid. If you want to say, "I know you can't see this on my slide," or "I know it doesn't show up," well, then fix your slide. There's things to do about it so that or don't put it on there at all. And, I'm actually not a grown up. You would think I could tell time, but I can't. So I'm going to ask someone else, "Please watch the clock." No, no, that's a sign that you're not skilled. If you're asking your audience to keep an eye on the clock for you, that's a sign that you're not taking this professionally. It's your job to manage that. All of that stuff is this. All of that stuff is you're going to somebody's house for dinner and they're taking you into the kitchen. You're hearing all the rattling pots and pans and stuff. And I don't want that. I don't want that. I want to go to dinner. I want a nice dinner, right? I don't want to hear all the pots and pans clanking around. I don't want you to say, "These aren't my slides." No, I want the dinner to look good and smell good and taste good. I want it to be good. I want it to have a story arc. I want there to be an appetizer and an entree and a dessert, perhaps. And I want more. I don't want to be so stuffed that I'm thinking, "Better not ever go back there." That's a good dinner. First impressions. Again, this is sort of aspirational, as you've already probably figured out. Your first 30 seconds really matter. So you'll see a lot of people when they start talking, they will spend a lot of time thanking their hosts and thanking this and chit-chatting, and trying to warm up the crowd for the talk. Don't do that. Don't do that. It's okay when you start to just look around the room. On Zoom, that's a little bit trickier. You can't tell that I'm looking at Mercelin right now. You can't tell that. Um, but it's okay to start, with a little bit of a pause, and we'll talk about that again in a few moments. And make eye contact. Pick half a dozen people that you're gonna not on Zoom, but that you're gonna make contact with. A good opening line that I did not use today is, "I'll bet you're asking yourself." So sort of a way to get people engaged. Don't need to do that for this particular talk, but sometimes that's a good way to kind of engage the audience. And we're going to talk about pronouns a little bit later on. It's good to have people know where you are in the talk. So you want to kind of have an outline, a general sense of what we're doing. And I try to demonstrate that, an example of that. I walked through what I was going to talk about. It's the tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them gambit. So get their permission. I did that. It gives you a little bit of a sense that you could have actually said, "No, Dr. Weisbart, that's not what we were supposed to tell you." You could have done that. I have had it happen once. One time at the Missouri State Legislature had them say, no, you're supposed to talk about Medicaid, not that. So that doesn't happen very often, but it does. So it's a good idea to just kind of validate that with you. And you really do want to, you do want people to know where you are, right? So you know that coming up at some point, there's going to be breakout groups. And you know that after that, there's going to be sort of a close-up session for a few minutes. So you kind of know that there's that bit of the arc. You know some of the things we're going to be talking about. And that's good. I mean, so you have some idea of where we are in this. When I first started thinking about managing people's expectations, though, I would actually put up a thing on the slides that said we are now on part 2 of 6, and then the topics would go down. And that's a little bit too much of a work plan. Then, you're looking at that going, he's only on part 2. There's 4 more of these parts left. So you don't want to be that proscribed. Likewise, I don't think you want to have numbers on your slides, page numbers on your slides, because someone will then at some point midway through go, he's already shown us 35 slides. How many more slides are there? It's so you want to sort of have a workflow, but not really a work plan for people. And think of this as theater. Think of it as theater. When you go to a concert, you don't want the piano tuner to be the first one out. You want them to have tuned the piano before you got there, so that then when the musician comes out, they might take a bow, but they'll start playing right away. And that's the same thing with you. Don't spend time sort of calibrating things. Have that done. I'm terrible at this, planning the opening line, but I've been told that that's a really good thing to think through. What exactly is the first thing they're going to hear you say? And I'm terrible at that, but it's some people find that really helpful. And well, I don't need to read that line to you, do I? So one of the worst things is when somebody puts up this multi 10 sentence, or 10 line, 12 line slide, and they're basically just reading it to you. That's a recipe to bore people. Okay, here's the first of the models that I want you to sort of have in your head when you're structuring a talk. And this applies both to speaking to individuals as well as to speaking to large groups. First, comfort zones. This is not mine. um, this is my wife's. This is a comfort. This is a bead store. In case you don't know what that is, this is a store where you can go in and they have, I would guess, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of these little tiny things, and you can walk around in them and pick which of the tens of thousands you want. Think of them as facts. Tens of thousands of little tiny things. My skin starts to crawl when I start to look at the amount of detail that's in that. On the other hand, I really like this stuff. I really like the jewelry that comes out of it. So think about, I suggest you think about your story arc as that you've got a bucket of beads and you don't want to just download the bucket of beads. You want to assemble a nice piece of jewelry for people to think about. You want to assemble a real thing. So more specifically on comfort zones, here's somebody that I've never met anyone else who's heard of this guy, but I thought it was kind of brilliant when I heard his model, Manny Alkine, the whole brain model. I think it just really impressed me a lot with this. And he said that there's 4 different comfort zones that we have. One is facts, and this is numbers, basically, facts. Some people are really comfortable in the bead store with all those facts. Other people, it's more about the process forms. Okay, I get your facts, but how are we going to do this? What's the method that we're going to accomplish this with? Some people, if you don't have a methodology, if you don't have a process, the facts and the rest of it doesn't mean anything. Others could care less about that. They assume that there's a bunch of facts and they know that there's a process you could create, but I've got to know where you're going. If I don't know where you're going, I am not interested in what you're talking about. And then lastly, there's a group that none of that is the priority. It's got to be with, a human face. It's got to be feelings and personal. It's got to have that level to it. So we all have some of each of these in our head, but you can actually do personality assessments of people by this structure and find that most of us have one of these quadrants in which we're the most comfortable. And most of us don't think about these quadrants. And so we assume that the quadrant in which we're the most comfortable is the quadrant in which everybody else is the most comfortable. And so we talk from our own quadrant. And that's a guaranteed way to not get through to people. So if you're talking one-on-one to somebody, what you want to do is first listen. And when I'm listening, I'm not just saying, listen, I'm saying actually think about, okay, this person's really bringing up the human side of this. Okay, this person is disputing the numbers that I'm saying. Okay, this person is talking about you know, how are we going to do it? Think about which quadrant they're in, and then respond in that quadrant. So I'm thinking of giving one of my single payer talks, and somebody gets up in the back for questions and says, that's all fine and good, but my uncle is in Canada, and he was on the waiting list to have back surgery, and he had to wait so long that for his back surgery, and had so much pain that he had a heart attack and died while he was waiting. What about that, Dr. Weisbart? And my response, as a counterexample of what not to say, my response was, well, here's the numbers about the waiting lists in Canada, and here's the numbers about the waiting lists in the United States. So you can see, exactly the wrong response, right? This was a person who was opening with the bottom right quadrant, and I was answering in the upper left quadrant. So it was like I was speaking Italian, and he was speaking a different language. I wasn't addressing him. But what you could have done, what I could have done, what I wish I had done, was to hear his story about his uncle, recognize that this is a personal tragedy, said something at least giving the illusion of empathy. If you can't be empathetic, at least learn how to give the illusion of empathy, and say something that's a terrible story. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And then you can maybe segue to, that reminds me of the story that one of my patients, here in Toledo, that had such and such happen. And then, so you're still in tune with the right quadrant, and then say something to the effect of, that shouldn't happen to your uncle. That shouldn't happen to my patient. As it happens, the numbers show that it happens a lot more often to people in the United States because the system in Canada is better at preventing those kinds of things, but it happens anywhere. And go back to their quadrant. It happens anywhere, and I'm so sorry to hear what you went through. So start and end in that person's quadrant, and feel free to wander into yours once you've sort of validated them. So that's kind of the general approach when you're talking one-on-one in the discussion. When you're talking to a group, what you want to do, if you've got 10 people in the room, or 100 people or 1,000 people, you're on the Zoom thing, you can assume that there are people in the room whose comfort zone is one and not two of these quadrants, and that they are different. You can assume that there will be somebody in the room with whom your talk will not resonate unless you've hit their comfort zone. So I wouldn't say that it's a skill that I've mastered, but what I try to do is think about my presentation, if it's a longer one, and roll around these quadrants. So that at least every 4 or 5 minutes, I've gone back to a piece of it. For example, I told you about this patient, this guy at the back of the room whose uncle died in Canada. That was hitting the bottom right quadrant for just a moment, but I put a face on it. We opened with a face. So try to migrate around these quadrants, and I'll show you where that's particularly important in a few minutes. So what do these quadrants mean for single payer when you're talking about it? Facts and figures. Well, we have no shortage of facts and figures. Forms, some people it really makes a big difference for them to learn that there's an active bill in the House and in the Senate. That changes this whole thing from a bunch of, think tank, liberal, whatever, oh, if we pass those bills, this will be law. Oh, okay. Well, let's get or for some people, it helps them to know that, actually a lot of this is contained in the Social Security Act. And if we just made Medicare disappear at age, stop requiring 65, drop that age limit down, you would accomplish a lot of this. It's not really as simple as that, but that kind of framing again makes it, oh, that's a process. We could do that process. Or a future. You can easily imagine a variety of futures and try to match it up with the future that resonates most with your audience. And of course, if you're talking, you want to hit your stories or your family stories, or your patients' stories. And if you do that, it's good to sort of try to activate the nurturing part of somebody's brain, and then of course, bring it back home. Story arc. Here's a little bit of data about how to structure a story arc. And I'm going to draw some conclusions that I think are okay from serial position data. So if you give somebody 10 numbers to remember, the chances are they'll remember the first number or two and the last few numbers, but they're not going to do so good in remembering the middle. And the longer the story is, the longer set of words you have, the longer that middle gets depressed. So you notice they didn't put me on the first week. They didn't want you to remember it that much, but I'm flattered that they have me near the end because that means, so I'm probably reading more into that. I'm probably, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I was just reading this book about becoming Madam Secretary, and he said to Francis Perkins, as a compliment, he said, "Be sincere, be brief, and be seated." So the longer you go on, the longer they spend in the difficulty recalling phase. So if that's really kind of how memory works, and I'm generalizing beyond the 40 number recall, but the general shape is, I think, correct. Um, teachers, academics call this ability to remember the beginning the primacy effect, and they call this ability to recall the most recent numbers the recency effect, and they call the middle of your talk the dead zone, because the recall of this is the least. So that's one of the places where I think it's really important to try to rekindle, the personality linkages that you're talking to. So it's particularly important in the middle to roll around amongst these quadrants. So it turns out that pharma, our friends in the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry, they understand this really well. And here's some congressional testimony about where side effects are mentioned in television ads. They mention it not at the beginning and not at the end, but they mention side effects right in the middle, so you can not recall it so well. So your story arc has 4 components. First, the opening. The purpose of your opening is to engage your audience, to establish that there's some reason why they should listen to you, right? And just simply the fact that you're in med school, or they're introduced that way, you hopefully have some credibility and some reason why you care about this. Activate the nurturing part of their brain. So I had a doc that I worked with a lot, and we got him he dug up a story of a patient of his who had some real bad foot problem. I think it was a diabetic foot and eventually an amputation because they couldn't afford their insulin. It was a story that related to healthcare access. And so his opening comments, we got him a picture of somebody cradling a foot. And that made people really want to nurture. And we're going to come back again about why nurturing is so important. And getting permission sort of was a trick of engaging, which we did do. Second part is the problem statement. And a friend of mine was working at Nat Geo, or its predecessor, when they first had their first Shark Week, and they did a shark episode, and he was in the room. He was a marketing person. He was in the room, and the CEO came in the room, and they just had this Shark Week, and she took on their whiteboard. She wrote this: "The more ferocious the predator, the higher the ratings." So they discovered that if they put up a shark, people would watch their show. And you've seen that kind of take over the industry, but they stumbled into it with a ferocious predator causing high ratings. So having a problem that's concerning is important at the beginning, up to a point. When you state your problem, you don't want to state 30 problems. You want to focus on 3 and maybe lump things into 1, 2, or 3. And you don't want to have the problem be the whole thing that you're talking about. And we see this all the time, right? A lot of presentations that we go to are nothing but extended problem statements. One of my favorite communications experts, Annette Shankara Osario, is famous for saying that Americans have 99 problems, and they're not looking for number 100 to complete the set. They're not looking for you to give them the next problem. So, and then when you're doing the problem statement, you want to have it resonate to all the parts. And then, of course, there's the solutions. So, Martin Luther King's, one of his more famous lines was, "I have a dream." He did not say, "I have a work plan." He said, "I have a dream." I don't know how closely you followed Elizabeth Warren's campaign when she was, running on for president, and she was heavily on the single payer platform. In my mind, her campaign started to really struggle the more she started unpacking the details of her plans. So I have a plan for that. Plans are not as inspiring as dreams. Plans are realistic. I understand the reason, and her saying I have a plan for that really motivated me a lot. But nobody's motivated by a plan. They want a plan. They want to know there's a plan, but your solution has to be inspirational and have some vision to it and have some degree of a roadmap. So, here's how we're going to get there. We're going to do this, 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 and then we can get off the highway because we'll get there. It's interesting. When I started giving my single payer talks, somebody, it would be pretty short, and then somebody would ask a question, and I would give them, sort of a longer answer to that. And then the second time I would give the talk, I would think, well, they asked me about this part of it. I'd better put that into my topic. So my talk would go from 10 minutes to 12 minutes because I embedded that last group's question into my core talk. And then before you knew it, I was talking for forever, and my talks went going on and on and on, as today's might seem to. Uh, so, um, so you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. Limit your presentation to the stuff you want to, the stuff that compels you, the stuff that you want to communicate. Limit your presentation to the stuff you care about. And if you've got like some things that you think are important obstacles you want to unpack, save that for the Q&A if that's the kind of setting you have. If somebody, there's, you want to talk about, well, what'll this mean for employment? Aren't there a lot of jobs that are going to be lost? What'll this mean for the stock market if we disrupt so much of the GDP? What'll this mean for, such and such? You don't have to include that in your talk. You can just get to your point at the beginning and then let somebody else ask you that question from the audience. And that's useful because you don't actually know what that group has on their mind. So let them tell you what's on their mind. Give as much space for Q&A as you can. And if there's a part that you want to talk about that you took out of your talk because you thought it was good for the Q&A and you're halfway through the Q&A and nobody's asked you about the yada yada that you think is so important, you can ask them, hey, does anybody here care about such and such? Raise your hand if you're, so you can introduce a question. You don't have to completely turn over the agenda. You can ask questions of yourself. But put that sort of stuff into the Q&A. Don't feel like you have to embed it all into the core talk when you're talking live to a live group particularly. And then, of course, for most groups that you'll be talking to, you want there to be some calls to action, And it's important to remember that not everybody has to be asked to do everything all the time. You know what SATB is? Anybody know what SATB is? That's musicians call that soprano, altos, tenors, and bass. So the story there is that there's so many things you could be doing, but only do some of them some of the time. You don't have to be singing all the time. And in fact, good music doesn't have everybody singing all the time. Good music will have the sopranos singing now, and the tenors have the next section, and sometimes the sopranos and the bass will sing together. So you don't have to expect people to do everything all the time. Do the parts you want to do. Your call to action should be something they can do like immediately. So I've taken lately to putting up QR codes on and saying, oh, pick up your phone and take a picture, activate this, do this right now, or give them a phone number to write down. To some action. Any action is the first. Every trip starts with the first step, right? So any action you can get somebody to start taking is good. The more you can get people to commit that they're going to do something, the more likely they are. We've done little experiments with that and found that just getting people to say, yes, I'm going to do this makes that group more likely to. Asking them gets more people to do it. So try to get a commitment. But how do you balance this? How do you balance this? Well, the first is you have to figure out how to get from one to the next. So think about your on-ramps and your off-ramps. Is actually how I think about this. So I wanted to get to comfort zones, and I didn't want to open with comfort zones. So I took you into a bead store. I saw that as an on-ramp to getting into the comfort zones. I don't know if you've ever watched much of Rachel Maddow, but she's like the queen of this. She does, her narratives. When you watch her first A block, so to speak, it's like, I know we're not here to talk about bead stores, but how is she going to get from there to something of germane and importance to today? She's like brilliant at that. So if you want to really study on ramps, I recommend watching some of hers. And so, examples of how you could do it, think of almost anything, but think about how you're going to get to the next section. Don't just abruptly go, now what are we going to do about it? Think about how you're going to get to the next section. And this is what you don't want to do. This is what you don't want to do. You don't want to just talk to the slides. Remember, the slides should just be enhancing you. You shouldn't be there to enhance the slides. So You don't want to be doing that at all. The balance of the talk, though, should be not all about the problem statement. And I promise you, I don't know who it is, but I promise you, some people during last week or during the next 3 weeks will not balance it this way. They will be talking almost entirely about the problem statement. Okay, I mean, we need some of that. We clearly do. But if you're doing a 1 hour talk or a 20-minute talk to a Rotary Club or a 10-minute talk, you know, you don't have to spend most of your time convincing them that the house is on fire. That's not the problem that we need to do. A little bit, but not completely. So keep your opening brief. Think about your time carefully and how you're going to actually think about, I've got 10 minutes. I'm going to spend 3 on this, 8 on that, and then, oh, shoot, now I'm over. So think about that and try to start promptly. It always kills me when I'm, at some group where oh, let's give them a few more minutes to get here. Oh, we're only, let's just wait, let's wait, and you blow through the first 10 minutes. And then at the end, there's not enough time. You're about 10 minutes short of time, and I've done careful scientific study of this, and it turns out, in case you haven't done this research, the first 5 minutes of your talk are exactly as long as the last 5 minutes of your talk. So don't waste them. That's why I kind of kickstarted us when it was 3:01. I said, well, let's get started. The first 5 minutes are just as long, so don't waste them. This is an acronym that my wife made up, and it's so funny because, trust me, she does not want to be bossed. But she heard she gave me a critique on one of my talks, and I found it really useful. And want to unpack it for you. Boss it. I actually have a little pocket gadget that's got that written on it that I keep in my pocket when I'm in front of big crowds, so that I try to remind myself when I'm speaking to boss it. And if something goes wrong, if at the end of the talk, when I'm critical to myself, and I think that didn't go so well, I'll give myself a B or a B minus on that one. It's usually because I violated one of these 4 rules. So this is a really helpful acronym for me, and for others, I think too. So boss it, breathe. Obama was great at that. I don't know if you ever remembered, if you see Obama speak, he would look. He wouldn't look at the camera. He would look at the someplace, and he would breathe. And I'd be sitting there going, come on. So it would build drama. It would give him a chance to think and organize his thoughts. And it's okay. So the very first thing you want to do when you're speaking, I think, actually, is not run on the stage and go, hey, how about those bears or whatever. You want to, go out and actually give yourself a moment to breathe. That's okay. Breathe for a lot of reasons, including, you know, I'm fond of breathing. Second is own it. Don't do what I just did. I said, I'm fond of breathing. Second is, I didn't own that little joke. That was a joke, right? I said, and I'm fond of breathing. And then I went right into own it. Um, so you may not even have realized that I was trying to make a joke when I said I'm fond of breathing, right? If you're gonna say something, mean it. If you're going to say something, if not, if you're just as an aside of, a casual thought, don't say it. Or if you do say it, use some technique to emphasize it, which we'll get to in a few more minutes. So if you're going to say it, own it. It's yours. Keep it, or don't say it. So this is an example of where I mean it being aspirational, because it's hard to do that sometimes. But yeah, if you're going to say it, own it. And then for me, it's useful to think about slowing down. Um, and for some people, for others, I know it's important to think that. But here's a great little book we're going to come back to, TED Talks. And the people that make the TED, and I'll show you that reference at the end again. The people who do the TED Talks actually have a book called TED Talks about how to speak in public. And they say most speakers need to speed up. They say most speakers need to speed up. I'm not so sure about that, but TED Talks are great, so I guess that's good advice. But for most people that I've seen doing talks like these, they need to slow down so things can land, people can understand what you're saying, and that sort of meshes in with owning it. And then simplify, simplify it. Um, Nobody knows your acronyms. Nobody knows your acronyms. So try to talk about it in a way that anyone can understand. And that, you know, it sounds at first when I say that it means try to think of your audience as a group that doesn't know anything about your subject. That's not even really the case. Even the most compelling speakers, well, let me take Don Berwick, for example. He's one of the most compelling speakers, former head of Medicare. He's a compelling speaker, and he speaks to world-class audiences in the simplest, straightforward language, and it makes him so easily understood and compelling, because that's where we all actually, are. Emerson, simplify, simplify, simplify. And Rowe, one simplify would have done, Ralph. So yes, simplify it. Okay, be yourself, but don't take too many chances with humor. Humor, you really have to kind of know your audience to use humor. An awful lot of humor is just plain not funny. So especially when you're talking to a big group, be very, God, don't do anything insulting or inappropriate in humor. Um, Judge yourself about that. But humor is something you have to use really carefully. So say what you think, say what you believe. They've actually studied whether teachers are more effective or less effective if they stand still behind the podium or in front of a podium, or if they walk around, or if they, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if a speaker walks to the far end of the lecture hall and back, or if a speaker, it turns out that that's not a predictor of how effective a teacher is going to be. So move if you want to move, and don't move. If you don't like moving around, then, don't feel like you have to start moving to become more effective. Um, Remember that how you dress will identify your tribe to people, and tribalism is very important. So you want to be comfortable, but think about whether you want to be giving the signal that you are overdressed, underdressed, or matched. You generally want to try to match in accordance with your audience, or one level fancier. You don't want to go too far in either direction. Well, it says that twice there. So one thing that doesn't work is, if you like to do this, you should stop doing that. Don't do this. Um, when I was listening to somebody who I had to hear over and over and over again, and he would do this, and I actually found myself trying to calculate his height based upon the periodicity of his sway. I got so distracted because there are formulas, but turns out that's not very reliable. Um, Friend of mine that I was teaching to give public speaking, he's really into Harry Truman, and he has the best Harry Truman stories. And so when he gives his talk, it's so hard for him to not give a 3-minute side road into one of his Harry Truman stories, which I personally love. Um, but I've persuaded him that he can only talk about Harry Truman if at the end of that there's a punchline that goes back to the topic. And if there isn't, don't bring that story up. This is not your only rodeo. You'll have other chances to talk. Schedule the Harry Truman talk if you want to do that. You don't want to, well, on Zoom it's kind of weird, but you don't want to be talking you want to be projecting, right? You don't want people to be struggling. There will be some people in the room that are not of the best hearing, but even without them, if they have to really work at hearing you, it's kind of fatiguing. So it's so easy to remember to use your outdoor voice when you're starting your talk. But after a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes or so, then you start thinking that you're like talking to yourself in your kitchen, or that you're talking just, and you stop. No, the whole time that you're giving your presentation, you want to be remembering to use your outdoor voice. Um, Buckminster Fuller, I had the pleasure of seeing one time, and he said this. Be remembered for somebody. He came. This was in the early 70s, right? Everybody was in tie-dye. And he came up to speak in a white shirt, black suit, and a thin black tie. And I mean, he didn't fit in at all. And somebody asked him, "Why are you dressed like that?" And his answer was completely wrong. But his answer was, he wanted to be remembered for his content and not for his clothing. He thought a black suit, white shirt, black tie would have us not remember his clothing, whereas that's like the only thing I remember from what he spoke. But so, be thoughtful about this. Pronouns, I promised you we would get back to these. And so there's obvious, gender issues with pronouns that one has to be really thoughtful about. But that's a different point. It's a different set of issues about pronouns I wanted to talk about. First person singular. Use them. It's a power pronoun. Use that. I don't know how many times a salesperson has sucked me in by the use of his first person singular pronoun. We bought an HVAC system for our house once. The salesperson came by and said, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and I'm going to put one of these over here. And I was thinking he was the owner of the company. I don't know. And then, of course, it turns out he was just the salesperson. And we agreed to the contract. He left. We never saw him again. But he didn't say they, he said I. Very powerful to use first person singular. It implies that you're the owner of the information. And why not? We're gonna do that. Who's we? Well, me and Marvin, we're gonna do that. Well, who's we? It's just not as compelling. We have found that. Who's the we that has found that? No, I have found. I looked at this, we. So we still is ownership, but it's weaker. You engages people. You should know this. But you do know this, don't you? You know this, engages people. Rush Limbaugh, and you're welcome for this, was a master of this. I forced myself to, in case you haven't figured out, I disagree with Rush Limbaugh on everything that he had to say ever. But my personal point of view, but he was a really skilled speaker on the radio, very skilled. And so I listened to him for long as I could stand, about 5 minutes, twice a week for a good 6 months. And I tried to study his speaking techniques. And for second person pronouns, huge use of second person pronouns, he would say things like, well, you know this. And you're thinking, I do know that. Well, you're a smart listener. I am. You wouldn't for very long be doing that, but someplace in your head you go, I do know that. Second person, you know this, very engaging and very powerful. And here in Missouri, all y'all is a thing. So I don't know if you know that phrase. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase "y'all come down." Well, all y'all is the plural of y'all. So all y'all here today. Um, I find that entertaining, but it's also, I'm bringing it up here because notice for yourself any sort of language quirks you have. They will reveal something about. So if you use the phrase "y'all" or "all y'all" in Missouri, people will understand you. They'll just they won't even notice that you did that. If you use that in New York City, they're going to go, where is what? All y'all? What are you talking about? So, just be thoughtful about how you use second person pronouns. So they, right? We all know, a good reason to be using they at times. But other than that purpose, they can also be implying a group other than yourself. They is not you. They is not me. I am not they. They means somebody other than me. And here's another person with whom I don't typically agree, who was very good at you and they pronouns. So here's a direct quote from here. They want to control what you do. Right. So here he's setting up not just they and me, he's setting up they versus you. They want to control what you do. They want to destroy you. They want to destroy your way. They and you, an important dialogue. And actually, the New York Times reviewed that and said that they, you framing are tools commonly used by populist or authoritarian leaders to create emotional connections. Am I suggesting you should become a populist authoritarian leader? No. But I am suggesting you be conscious of this as a tool that you might occasionally want to have in your tool belt. You might occasionally want to have the they, you framing in your tool belt. If you're talking about corporate takeover of healthcare, if you're talking about, you might want to say, these corporations, they want to keep you from doing such and such. So there might be, don't go too heavy down this road because it's dark down there, but you might want to occasionally just have that in your belt. Okay. Okay, more practically about speaking, be prepared, know where you're going, make sure you actually got the Zoom link. You know, how many times have not gotten the Zoom link until, oh, I thought I sent that to you. So make sure you have an actual Zoom link, and it's a good idea to have the cell phone number of your key contact so that if everything's not working, you have some way to reach people. If it's a college campus that you're invited to speak to, those are the hardest. You know your campuses really well, but remember back to the first day you were there, you were lost. Where is the Peachtree building? You were lost. And so if you're coming in as a speaker, you're invited to speak at some campus, you're going to get lost. I promise you. So, get a map, and that's not even necessarily the best answer because then there's construction. So, if you're going in and it's an important gig and you're speaking to a lot of people, I'll ask my host to try to have somebody meet me at the parking garage or someplace and walk me. It's an okay thing to do, I think. So because it's tricky sometimes. Equipment. Um, I'm a junkie of bringing my own laptop. And if you do that, make sure you have every possible cord to connect to every possible projector, every possible adapter. You want to have your own slide advancer. They're so cheap, they're so easy, and it's so much easier. Um, I don't know how many times I've been someplace back to the adapters where they would tell me that they have everything that they need, and you get there and they don't have it. There was one church that I was going to speak to, and the pastor was a younger person, and I asked him what equipment they had, and he said, "Yeah, we've got this projector. As long as you've got an HDMI port on your laptop, you'll be fine." And I'm thinking this guy can spell HDMI, so that's good. So this is probably going to work. So I show up, and there's no projector in the room. And I said, "Where's the projector?" He says, "That's in the other room." Yeah, somebody else has that room today. Do you have a projector? The answer actually was yes, because I've met people like this before. And if I'm not flying, I have a nice projector and every possible cord you could want, and I'm self-contained. I have a screen. Bring as much of your own equipment as you can, including a projector and a screen, no matter what they tell you. They'll tell you, "Oh, yeah, we've got a big screen. We'll connect you to the big screen." And the big screen turns out to be no bigger than your computer monitor because that was a big screen for them. But you're in a gymnasium that has 200 people, and the screen is an 18-inch computer monitor. Been there, done that. So, had enough of these things happen that if it's at all possible, when I'm giving a talk someplace, I will bring my own projector. I will bring my own big screen that fits the biggest one that fits in my car and all the cords. Yeah, and have your own slide advancer, but don't use the laser. They've all got lasers built in. Do not use the laser. It's just not the right thing. So bring all of this. Oh, I guess okay. And have a three-prong adapter. Have a really long extension cord. I went to one place. It was in this beautiful old building, and the only plug was 100 feet away from where all of our equipment was, and there was no electricity. There was no electricity, so I travel with a 100-foot extension cord. So have everything, sort of have contingencies for failure. Nice to have your whole slide presentation on a thumb drive so that if your laptop dies or whatever, or you can't connect it, you can use somebody else's. And if you're kind of starting and you're not confident and you don't really know your material well enough yet, have index cards or even a paper copy of it. Bring a clock, bring a timer, have your phone, with the clock set to easily, most phones, my phone, I don't think most of them are like that. You just tap your phone and there's the time. So have it someplace where you don't have to kind of fiddle with it and don't look at your watch. That's a bad thing to do. That reveals that you're thinking about something else. So don't do that. So I usually have my phone someplace within easy reach so that I can tap it and just sort of glance around like that and see the time to help stay on track. So manage your own time. Don't have somebody else's. Some people will go to these talks and they'll bring a library with them and they'll set up 100 handouts in front, or I'm exaggerating. Okay, 30, handouts. And well, this one's about this topic, it's really good. Well, but this one's about that, and it's real, and you'll have somebody, most people going through that line will actually pick up one of each one because they, oh, that, and then they'll throw them all out later and you'll have spent a lot of money and, no, they won't have read any of it. So have one handout. Have one, and PNHP has some spectacular new handouts. Have one, maybe two, but don't fill up a bookstore. There are bookstores in the world, and you don't need to create one. Everything you hand out should have "how do I get a hold of you" information. There's got to be some code on it so that because they won't remember your name. They won't remember, they'll remember your host. So maybe they can figure it out. But if they have something of yours, put your name on it, or at least your organization's name. If you're in person, it's great to have paper email sign-up sheets. If you can. I guess now that we're far enough away from the pandemic, we can pass things around again. So that's good. And the best way to use these, if you tell people, yeah, and when you get out, go to pnhp.org and sign up to be a member, you'll get 1%. If on the other, and maybe more than that, if on the other hand, or you can put up a QR code on the screen and you'll get about 20%, 25%. But if you, or sometimes 50%, but if you have clipboards that have a nice little form for your name, your email, maybe your phone number or something, the basic, not your street address, you're not going to be sending them snail mail. So keep it really simple and non-intrusive. So something like that. And what I like to do when I'm about halfway through my talk is have my host already armed with 2 or 3 clipboards and pens. And my host, not me, I want my host, whom they know and trust and like, or they wouldn't be in the room. So you've got a positive transference, positive cathexis, to use psychiatric terms. So my host will then go around and put the clipboards in 2 or 3 strategic places in people's hands and ask them to go around the room. Do that in the middle. If you try to get them to sign up when they're coming in, they'll walk right by it oftentimes, unless you force them, and that's sometimes the right way. But or if you have them at the exit when they're leaving, they're leaving. They're leaving. So if they're halfway through, you're halfway through and you've done a decent job, say to the group, I'd like to, if you like this talk, we have another few minutes of it to talk about, but I'm going to ask Bob over here to pass out sign-out sheets. And if you want to hear more of this kind of thing, fill this out. Do it about halfway through. Then there's enough time for people to fill it out and pass them around the whole room. If you brought 2 or 3 or 4 of them, depending on how big the room is. So paper sign-up sheets, you'll get everybody. You'll get like everybody. And then that's a thing that you can deal with. Business cards for some groups, terrific. And they're so cheap. So have business cards that you can give to folks. If you found this part hard to remember, not to worry. I'm expecting you not to remember most of this. So we can give you a handout that has all of this information, because we are right about there in this talk. So, okay, so the day of the event, manage yourself. And that means, some people I've seen thinking, oh, I'm going to be talking, I'm a little nervous about this. I want to be really, I've heard that caffeine makes me about 5 or 10 IQ points higher. I want to be smart today. So I'm going to take some extra, and then no, be physiologic. Be physiologic, if that's a word. Don't skip your coffee. Don't have extra coffee. Have your normal dose of coffee. If you have a cold, maybe don't take an antihistamine, and don't take pseudoephedrine. I've made that mistake in both directions and had the problems you can expect from both directions. So try not to do that. Just sniffle a little bit more and apologize. I'm sniffling. You don't know what you're walking into. You don't know what even if you've been there before, you don't know what you're walking. You get there and there's a sign that we've moved the room to such and such. So get there early, make sure your laptop connects, and then you don't have to worry about it. Your laptop's connected, you know what you're going to talk about, and then you can relax and you can do some of the other stuff I'm going to talk about in a minute. So get there at least 30 minutes early. Don't get there 5 minutes early unless it's like a really special situation. But then once you're set up, you can mingle. And what I like to do is to pretend that it's a party at my house. And my job is to do a couple things. My job is to get people to feel comfortable, make them, come in, and also to find out who invited you. And I don't mean that literally who invited. I mean, like, why are you here? Why did you decide to come here? And so I often will do that. What are you hoping to get out of this? What are you looking for? And that'll help you kind of think things through and get their name. So, if you're talking about a topic they brought up, you can say, hey, and Steve over there said that he wanted to hear about such and such. So we're going to get to that right now, Steve. So, you can kind of connect a little bit with that. And you never know what you're going to find out when you ask people, why are you there? So it's worth doing that. And maybe you can use what they tell you, because you're going to be using it. You don't need to be speaking very much during this 30 to 60-minute phase. You're asking questions. You don't need to make your case. You don't need to argue. You don't need to persuade. You really just want to find out what's on their mind. You're going to have plenty of time to talk. You're there to listen and maybe have something you can quote back to them about stuff. And think about your message, stay on track, don't go into Harry Truman. You're going to have other rodeos. If you have a diversion, it better be on topic. And then think about the layout of your space. Now, sometimes you have no influence over that, but sometimes you really do. I play ukulele, or ukulele, as they say. I was playing ukulele, and I was at this ukulele song circle, and the guy with his back most to us, with the black shirt with the orange stuff, he was leading the songs, and the people at the far end of the table couldn't hear him. Matter of fact, we couldn't really hear each other. It was laid out so crazy. But look at those tables. They're movable conference tables. So there's no reason that the room had to be set up like that. It was set up like this, right? That's the stupidest way to set up for this kind of a setting. Whereas we could have just moved the tables to that, and we could have then seen and heard each other. So if you're going to do this, you want to be a good guest. So you won't remember the nuance of how the tables were set up. Chances are your host will. So if you're going to move the tables, you do want to actually grab a quick picture of it so that when you're done, you can be a good guest and not have screwed up the thought that your host put into the tables. So I think that's David Ball. I forget who that is speaking there, but notice where he's standing compared to the podium and the table. So we're going to come back to that in a moment. So the room was set up for him to be like this, right? The room was set up with a podium on the left and a table, and the room was set up for him to be standing there. So that's nothing but barriers between you and the audience. Now, sometimes you can't help that. Sometimes you can't help that. Sometimes, they're recording you, the camera can't move, they've told you that the audio won't pick up or whatever, you've got to stand right there. Sometimes you can't help that. But in general, that's essentially a barrier and between you and the audience. And if you don't want them to interact with you, that's maybe a good thing. If you don't want them to throw things at you, that maybe is a good thing. But in general, you don't have to have the podium. You can get rid of the podium. You can walk over there. There's no reason not to do that. And that's what David did. He walked over there. So think about the sort of standard conference room setup. And then this is another one to think about. You're the green dot at the bottom. The projector is the smaller rectangle, and the screen over there. So I consider this torticollis de PowerPoint, right? The audience doesn't know where to look. They don't know where to look. They want to look at you, and they want to see your slides because, and they want to look at you, and, where do they look? And oh my gosh, is there anything you could have done about that? Well, yeah, you don't have to stand over there. You could move over here. You could have done that. Or even better, you could have gotten rid of those two seats so that the people don't have their back to the table. You can do this stuff. You can rearrange the room. It's completely, there's no room police that are going to tell you that, and then you'll be more comfortable and they'll be more comfortable. The best way for interactions is this, but you don't always want interactions. But if your purpose of the meeting is to get everybody talking to everybody, then this is a much better way to set it up. You go into the middle of the room, and then people are facing each other with no barrier. You're right there in the middle. So think about that. Think about it as a performance, which means you want to have eye contact. And if you can't make eye contact, pretend to make eye contact. I had a doc in my practice who was on the spectrum, as they say now, and he just could not make eye. And we taught him to stare here. So he could not. I mean, we tried. We could not get him to look in their eyes. We taught him to look here on somebody's head, and most people, it made enough of a difference. So likewise, if it's a big room, at least look at the forehead of people, go around the room and look, make eye contact around the room. Breathing, we talked about. What do you do if you're supposed to start and they're all talking and the room is noisy, and what do you do? One trick at that point, I mean, do you do that? I mean, what do you do? One trick is to just start talking. Don't say, you can try the everybody please be seated, gambit. I'm going to start in 2 minutes. 2 minutes before time, you can do that. But when it's time, remember those 5 minutes are exactly as long as the last 5 minutes. So when it's time, one gambit to get people to start listening to you is to give them something to start listening to. Start talking. and be sure you're up close enough to the microphone for that. Don't be talking from the stage where they can't hear you. Be sure that they can hear you and start talking. And it's amazing how much more effective that is to get the room to quiet down and start listening to you. So that's a really good trick. Think about how you're going to emphasize things. Some things, if you're talking in your outdoor voice, like I said, sometimes it's really powerful to not do that. Sometimes if you're used to speaking and then you go really quiet, that can be emphasis. Or you can use your glasses like a prop if you have glasses, or use them like a prop. You can use props. That's okay. But for sometimes you want to speak really quickly, but then you might want to really, so think about your pacing and your volume, and if you're not comfortable taking that pause, have a few pieces of paper or index cards. They don't have to have anything on them. You can have index cards in your hand and you're talking about somebody and you're thinking, I don't want to pause to think about that. He asked me something. I want to think about that for a minute. You can pause and look at your index cards, which are actually blank pieces of paper, and then go back. So have props, but feel free to pause. Doc I used to work with did this great. He would repeat a phrase and repeat a phrase and repeat, and if he would make a point, if he would make a point, if he would make a point, he would make a point. Repeating a phrase, you don't want to do this. You don't want to do this a lot because it's painful to do and to hear. But once in a while, repeat a phrase. It's another tool just to have in your little toolkit belt. Anybody know what an APM is? You shouldn't, because I made it up. APM, it's actualies per minute. And this is a real quote from place when we were doing speaker training back in my past life. Somebody actually said this. He said, actually, I actually find that this is actually an important point, actually. He said the word actually like every third word or every second word. And we know people like this, right? Some of us will say a lot. Some of us will say, or sorta, or something. We all have these quirks. So I try to help them pass this by tracking this metric. I used to, listen to him for 5 minutes and count the actualities in 5 minutes and give him an APM score. I thought that was hilarious. He didn't. He didn't find it. And more importantly, it didn't change his behavior at all. So if somebody tells you that you've got this tick in your speaking pattern, first thing is don't be offended, don't get defensive, don't get mad. Appreciate that, because most people will not give you critical feedback. Most people will tell you that was great, because they're pleasers and they want you to like them. And so most of the feedback you're going to get from talks is, that was great. You're really, no matter what they think, to get somebody to actually give you some specific constructive feedback, that's golden. So if somebody gives you, some feedback that's critical, take it to heart, because it took courage for them to say this to you. So take it to heart and pay attention. But what do you do if you've got this mannerism and, okay, some jerk like me said, pointed this out to you and came up with an acronym for this score? What do you do about it? Well, there's a technique: burn it out. So if you find that you say, as an example, what you can do is every day spend 2 or 3 minutes. You don't have to spend an hour, but every day try to spend 2 or 3 minutes, trying, to, burn it, out of, your, speech, pattern, so, by, the end, by the end of that window, do that every day, 2 or 3 minutes once a day for, I'd say, 7 days, 10 days. And by the end of it, you'll be so sick of the phrase, that you'll have substituted some other mannerism that you can then burn. No, you'll be so sick of it that you will notice it every time you or anyone around you says that phrase. So if you find that you have a mannerism, burn it out of yourself. And that's how it doesn't take too long to do it. So how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you practice? Have you heard of Toastmasters? So Toastmasters is everywhere in the world, and they are, nonpartisan, non-political. They are just an organization. I think they're a nonprofit, but their mission is to help people learn how to speak, give you practice time speaking. So um, I didn't look, this was a year ago. I meant to update the numbers. I'm not sure, but you can go there to one of their sessions for free. Just Google toastmasters.org, go to Toastmasters and Google what's the nearest one to me. There's probably one near you. And they have these regular meetings that you can go to. And they've got a whole menu of programs, but the one I would call you to is the one presentation mastery. And they give you every week you come in, you have to speak for a minute on a topic to a group of strangers. It's a topic you don't necessarily care about. It's people that you don't know and who aren't actually judging you, and it's just sort of a good chance to practice. A little tough to do, in med school, but it's actually very tough to do when you're in med school. But it's a way that you can get some practice at it. So where should you speak? Should you jump right in and go everywhere all the time? First, I would say start with the stuff. Start in easier, friendlier, supportive audiences. Don't start with take off a mole before you try to do neurosurgery. Try to start with the easiest piece first. So have some of your friends over to your house. If you still have friends, you're in your first year, yeah, you still have friends. Yeah. So have some of your friends over to your house and say, hey, especially some of your non-med school friends, if you still have any of those, and say, hey, I'm working on this thing. I want you to tell me, is this resonating? Is this clear? Does this make sense? Try to make it a safe environment for them to be critical. So do that. Faith-based groups tend to be oriented in support of this issue. Social worker groups, if you can get to them, they tend to be very supportive. Nurses and teachers, those groups. Med students generally are groups that will be receptive to hearing you, although obviously not always. But so these are almost like in rank order. Start at the top of this list and go to the bottom of the list. DSA and Green Party, they're publicly aligned with single payer. So if you wanted to speak to a setting like that, that's usually the okay thing to do. Some groups can really surprise you, so find out who they are. Democratic clubs, you would think, since it's not a bipartisan bill, much as we think it should be, much as we think it's a bipartisan issue, it's only Democrats so far who in Congress who have co-sponsored the legislation. So you would think those would be, but no, I mean, sometimes Democratic clubs will absolutely surprise you. So if you want to go to a Democratic club to talk to them, talk to the club chair first and get a sense of, what should I expect when I'm in the room? Because probably they'll be great, but not necessarily. Retirees tend to be very receptive, especially if you bring in the Medicare Advantage sort of chapter in a good way. In terms of specialties, in this sequence, psych tends to be, I think like 80% of psychiatrists support us. And working your way down that list to family medicine, where I think it's about 55% or so. So increasingly friendly and supportive. Um, and hospital staffs are usually people that you can talk to in a good way. Labor sometimes will really surprise you. What's the number? The majority of people who are in a union, the majority of people who are in a union are in a union that supports Medicare for all. That's not to say that the majority of unions support Medicare for all. So the bigger ones tend to, but labor tends to be a little surprising and hard to predict sometimes. And it's best if labor invites you rather than you sort of nudging your way into labor. That's best. So build those relationships, and then don't start with this third group. Don't start with surgery or radiology or anesthesia. They're not your adversaries, even in the least supportive areas. And I think anesthesia is the least supportive, and there it's still 30% of anesthesiologists support us. So it's not like the red zone. And I don't mean that in the political red blue thing. It's not the danger zone, but it's not where you want to go for your first talk as to these medical associations. Depends where you live, I guess. Depends where you live. So in some parts of the country, that's not quite as hard. But some parts of the country that can be really difficult. I personally find these groups to be my favorites to talk with. I don't know if you're very familiar with these groups, but like Rotaries, they tend to be local small to medium sized business owners from a community, and they meet every month, every 2 weeks, something like that, and they have to have a speaker. Their charter requires their hour-long meeting to have a speaker for 20 minutes. So there's usually a head of the local Rotary Club, and the head of the local Rotary Club took that position in part because they had a bunch of speakers they wanted to bring in. So they bring in a bunch of speakers, and then they've gone through all their speakers, and they're still the head of the local Rotary Club, and so they're often pretty receptive to, especially a med student, calling up and saying, "Hey, I'm a med student. I've got these thoughts about such and such, and I think it should resonate with the business community." And then think about how to frame your message to resonate with a business community. But Rotary clubs are enormously fun to talk to in my experience. They will give you 20 minutes, not 21 minutes. So really discipline your message there. So, I mean, if you're talking, you give your 20-minute spiel or whatever, then they want to keep you for another whatever, that's fine. You don't have to cut yourself off, but do not overstay your welcome unless they do that to you. So anyway, I found them pretty good. I have yet to get to a Republican club. I very much want to, and I have tried. I have cold called and invited. I've not made it in yet. So yeah, I promised you I'd show you this book, and indeed that's it. I really recommend. It's big font. It's not hard. It's not hard read. It's fun. It's got lots of examples and tremendous information about how to speak in public. Their number one bit of advice, they said, they call it their number one bit of advice they give to their speakers is make regular eye contact with members of the audience. Be warm, be real, be you. Unless you're an arrogant and self-centered, then pretend to be somebody else. So the very last thing, this is from Annette Shankar-Rosario, whom I mentioned before, as a really good sort of guru of messaging. And she says, the work of advocacy, we need to know the temperature, but we are here to change the temperature. Be a thermostat, not a thermometer. You're there to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. I think that's my